The first thing that we're going to be doing today, before we jump into our, the actual practice of the DBQ, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure we know a major theme. And the big theme that we're going to be working on today is going to be immigration. So there is a very good chance that you could get an immigration question on the day of the AP exam. Okay, it's one of the major areas of content that you are responsible for, and because immigration has been something that's happened throughout most of American history, it easily falls into periods 3 through 7. Now, we've practiced an immigration DBQ already. We practiced one on the beginning of first semester on second wave immigration. But we could get one on first wave immigration as well. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to essentially timeline for you the history of immigration in the periods that you guys have to know. Okay. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to take out a piece of paper, and what I want you to do is I want you to take a timeline and draw it across that piece of paper. Just a line, arrows on both sides. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually work on 3 separate eras of immigration. There have been 4 major waves of immigration in American history. And what we're going to do is we are going to learn a little bit about the 3 that could be on the test. So the test could cover any of the first 3 waves. The 4th wave actually is happening after 1945. So we're not going to focus on that today. So let's kind of just work through this with me together. So if you can, have that timeline drawn across. You can label it immigration timeline. And the eras that we're going to be talking about, our first era, which is known as the first wave of immigration, is going to be 1607 to 1790. All right, so that's our first wave of immigration that we're going to talk about. The second wave of immigration that we're going to talk about is going to be from 1815 to 1860. And then our last wave that we're going to talk about, our third wave, is going to be from 1865 all the way to 1924. Okay, each of these represents a major influx of immigrants that were coming into the United States. What we're going to talk about today is who is coming, why they're coming, did they experience any kind of, say, backlash, were there Americans that opposed those immigrants, and then what are some important events or terms that you might want to know associated with each of those different time periods. So I'm going to just kind of color each of these eras a little differently. I'm going to start off with the first wave. And the first wave is defined by what we refer to as primarily colonial immigration. So colonial immigration is going to begin outside of the time period that we need to know. It begins with Jamestown in 1607, but it actually goes all the way up into 1790, and we're talking about the Revolutionary era. So this is something that could be potentially on the AP exam. So, well, the first thing we want to know about is who is coming to America during this first wave of immigration. So I'm just going to write the who. Okay. So we talk about who is coming. Think about who was helping to colonize the United States early on in its history. And so if we go all the way back to the beginning of Jamestown and the founding of colonial America, you've got a lot of English, and specifically English Protestants. They're coming in large numbers. English Protestants are the ones that are settling at Jamestown. You've also got Protestants who are English who are maybe have slightly different religious views. So we know that the Pilgrims and the Puritans also helped settle the colonies during this time period. You've got other countries that are coming as well. Some of the other groups are like Germans. You've got Dutch. You've got Scotch-Irish. All of these groups are settling in the New World. And then maybe most importantly is Africans. Because they're kind of an exception to why a lot of these immigrants were coming. So let me kind of explain what was happening at this time period. So we talk about why. When we look at the why of who is coming in the colonial period, most of these people are coming of their own free will. Okay, so you've got a lot of people that are coming for like the purposes of like economic prosperity or land. I know it's hard to see. Land. That's terrible. Okay, let me zoom in on that. Let's zoom in on this completely. All right, so land is driving the opportunity for land, the opportunity for economic prosperity. Religious freedom is something that is driving people to the United States, or the colonies at this time period. Okay, so land, religious freedom. But there also is, like in the case of Africans, the fact that they're being forced. So some of this is a forced immigration in the form of slavery. Okay, and so the people that are coming here are not always coming because they choose to. Now, is there a backlash during this time period? Well, it turns out every single one of these eras have a backlash. Now, during this time period, there wasn't a major backlash, but there were some examples. A good example, I know this is going to sound weird, is Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin was actually worried in Pennsylvania of like the growing number of Germans and the fact that Germans didn't assimilate into colonial culture. So that was a big concern for him. So he actually voiced these concerns and wrote about these concerns. It wasn't like anything as extreme as what we're going to see later, but there were people who were concerned about immigrants even during this first colonial period. And now, there are some important terms that we should note that deal with immigration during this time period. So what are our important terms? What are some things that we should be aware of? Let's start with like the English and like the Pilgrims and Puritans that were coming over. A lot of them were coming over as part of something called like the indentured servitude. So indentured servitude was one way that immigrants gained passage to America. They couldn't afford the trip over on their own. And so what they did was they maybe would have someone who was wealthy pay for their trip over, and then they would work for them for a number of years. Another term that you should know, more associated with the Puritans, for example, would be the Great Migration. And the Great Migration represents like this flow of Puritans that were coming into New England in the years following like 1630. And they represented a huge like population boom to areas like the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Other terms that we should know would be for Africans coming over, you should know the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was the leg of the triangular trade that brought Africans to the New World as slaves, and was a horrible, horrible journey. And it was there were a lot of people that were killed along the way. And the conditions in these ships were absolutely terrible. As far as laws are concerned, it is important to note that in this first era of immigration, there are 0 laws. There's nothing that is really deciding who can come and who can't, except for money. Money is the only thing that is determining whether a person can make it to America or not. Okay, so let's go into like 1790. Why did immigration start to dry up after the American Revolution? Why do we see it kind of teetering off? Well, there's a real reason why this period ends. This period ends in 1790 because starting in 1790, the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars that followed it essentially made immigrants unable to, in some cases, come over to America. And so because there was so much turmoil that was happening in Europe and then eventually here in America, there really wasn't a lot of opportunities for immigrants to come to America in large numbers. And so essentially these immigration dwindles. But after the War of 1812, after the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars are over, we see another huge surge of immigration. Now, we call this the second wave because it's the second major flood of immigrants into America. Now, this second wave is also sometimes referred to as antebellum immigration because it's immigration that is primarily happening prior to the Civil War. Okay, so what was it like during this time period? And just like in the last period, we want to know, who is coming? Why are they coming? Is there a backlash? And what kind of terms should we know relating to this particular time period? So as far as the who is coming during this time period, a lot of the same groups are coming. You still have a large number of English. You still have, primarily Western Europeans. In fact, that's primarily who's coming, Western Europeans to this country. But some of those Western Europeans are different than those that came before. We see the emergence of what we call old immigrants. And old immigrants refers to a surge in primarily Irish and Germans coming to the United States. Now, Germans came before, but we start to see a larger number of Germans coming. And we also see the Irish especially being a group that is coming that hadn't been in as large a numbers coming to the United States. These old immigrants, primarily Germans and Irish, are making up a large bulk of who is coming to America during this second wave. Now, there is also one other group I want to mention who are going to come in towards the end of this period, and we start to see Chinese immigrants coming in at the end of the time period as a result of the California gold rush as well. So that takes us a little to our why. Why are immigrants coming in this time period? There's always going to be, like I said, push and pull factors. Push factors are things that are pushing people out of the country where they were from. Pull factors are things that are bringing them or drawing them to somewhere new. So we talk about the things that are, let's talk about push factors first. There are two major push factors that were happening at this time period. The first major push factor, which is kind of causing people to leave their country, would be the Irish potato famine. And the Irish potato famine and just the issue of starvation really made a lot of Irish want to leave that country just to find food. America was considered a place where there was lots of food. It was a plentiful country, and so many were attracted to this part of the world. Another group that is coming is the Germans, and they're going to be influenced by something called the German Revolution, which brought political turmoil to the country. The German Revolution required people to serve in the military. And so a lot of Germans came to America hoping that they would be able to gain more freedom, more experience democracy. So those are we call push factors. But there were pull factors as well. One of the main pull factors was the market revolution. And the market revolution was important because it meant that the United States economy was building up. And so there were new economic opportunities as part of the market revolution during this time period. We've got the growth of textile factories, for example, in the Northeast, but we also have the opening up of Western lands and the possibility for more new commercial farming happening in places like Illinois. And so this attracted immigrants into this part of into the United States. The Irish were more likely to settle in cities, and the Germans were more likely to settle on Western frontiers. Another thing that was drawing people to America was better transportation. So transportation was opening up opportunities to more easily come to the United States. The development of steamships, for example, the earliest railroads, the building of canals allowed for immigrants not only to get to America, but also allowed them to travel into new parts of America to have better economic experiences. And then lastly, we've got the California Gold Rush, which is happening in 1849, which is going to attract people from all over the world. And that's where we start to see Chinese immigrants starting to come into the United States. Now, there was other things as well. Obviously, America was building up a reputation as a place where there was more freedom, and that was also attracting people. But this is kind of second wave immigration in a nutshell. Now, what was the backlash during this time period? So there were people who were really concerned about these immigrants, especially the Irish, and they were especially concerned about the Irish because they were Catholic, and they were viewed as lower class, they were viewed as uneducated, they were viewed as a threat to Protestant values in the United States prior to this time period. And so like the Irish were especially scorned, and they experienced a lot of backlash. And what we see, probably the best example of a backlash during this time period, is no laws banning immigrants, but we see the creation of a party known as the Know Nothing Party. And the Know Nothing Party is a third party that's completely based on like an anti-immigration stance. They're what we call nativists. And nativists are people that believe that America should be for Americans. And so the Know Nothing Party doesn't want like the Irish or Germans coming in. If they do, they want to limit their citizenship, they want to limit their rights, and put up greater laws restricting who can come into this country. So that's kind of what is happening during this time period. As far as laws, like there are no specific laws. Once again, there aren't any kind of laws that are in place that are really saying who or who cannot come. As long as you could afford the trip over, technically America still has an open door policy that allows anyone to come to this country. I'm trying to think of just any other terms. A lot of the terms we've kind of already covered. Market Revolution is in there. Same with the Irish potato famine, the German Revolution. If I think of the Know Nothing Party, these are specific terms that are kind of embedded in what we've done here. If I can think of anything off the top of my head, I'll add to it. But I think that's good for now. Moving right along, we're going to see a disruption in immigration because of the Civil War, which makes sense because who's going to want to go to a country that is at war with itself? And so there were immigrants that were still coming, but we see a smaller number of immigrants compared to the wave that was happening in the 1840s. And then after the Civil War, we see a new wave emerging, which is our third wave. And that third wave is going to be what's referred to as the Gilded Age Immigration. Which obviously will continue into the early 20th century. Now, just like these previous times, Gilded Age immigration and the early 20th century immigration kind of has its own distinct features, own characteristics, like who's coming, why they're coming. And obviously there's some key events that are going to be important for you to know as well. So let's just talk about that really quick. So let's begin with the who. Okay, this is a big difference between who's coming in the Gilded Age versus who's coming in like the antebellum period or the colonial period before it. One of the things that you have to understand about the Gilded Age is that we see a major shift from what we called old immigrants in the previous time period to now new immigrants. And these new immigrants that are coming, they're coming from South and Eastern Europe as opposed to Western Europe, which is where the old immigrants were from. So these new immigrants are from Southern and Eastern European countries. And so for the first time, what that means is we have a large number of Italian immigrants. Greek immigrants, Polish immigrants, okay, Hungary, Russia, and so on and so forth. I'm going to be running out of space, but you've got immigrants who are coming into America who hadn't been here prior to that time period. And so this is dramatically changing the face of America. It's adding new cultures to our country, and it's making America a more diverse place. Now, the question of why are immigrants coming during this time period? There's a number of reasons that immigrants are coming. A lot of it is pull factors. A lot of them are coming because it's during this time period that we see the second industrial revolution taking place. And so there's an enormous amount of jobs that are available in the United States. You've got factory work that's becoming more and more available, and they need lots and lots of laborers in order to fill those positions. And so immigrants come to kind of fill those jobs. There's also the building up of the railroads, things like the Transcontinental Railroad. Was built on immigrant labor. The Irish in the east for the most part, and you've got the Chinese in the west. Oh, that reminds me, yes. We've got Chinese immigrants that are coming in, as well as Japanese immigrants. My bad. So there's Asian immigration continues, at least for a little while, in this third wave. Now, other things that are attracting people, there is America's democratic reputation. There's also the lure of the West. So there is the West is this place where like opportunities abound. So the mining frontier offered people opportunities. So did the cattle frontier. The Homestead Act, for example, was something that attracted people to Western lands because the government after 1862 was giving away free land, 160 acres for those that could go out there and claim it. And if it wasn't, let's see. Oh, hold on. I got two people that are. All right. Okay. Sorry. I had some people in the waiting room. I didn't recognize the names at first, but sorry. So, okay. So the Homestead Act attracted people with the possibility they could find, get free land. So between the economic opportunities, the promises of democracy, as well as the fact that there's a lot of poverty and even some cases like persecution. For example, there's a growing number of Jewish immigrants during this time period. And a lot of these Jewish immigrants come to America having escaped persecution in parts of Europe. And so these things attract people to this country, including obviously escaping war. Okay, so like America is a place that obviously offers opportunities for these groups of people. Now, there is a backlash, and a significant backlash during this time period. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what that looks like. It's during this time period that we see the first major laws that are designed to try to stop immigrants from coming into this country. So a good example is one of the first things that you need to know is the Chinese Exclusion Act. And the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was in 1882, I believe, essentially is one of the first law that actually restricts who can come into the United States. This law essentially prohibited the Chinese, at least Chinese laborers, from coming into America. Shortly after that, we've got Ellis Island opening up, which is a processing center for immigrants. That's in 1892. And Ellis Island, while most immigrants pass through Ellis Island, they do inspect people to try to make sure that no one's coming in. At first, they only look for diseases. They look for like having a certain amount of money in a person's pocket. They don't want women traveling by themselves. But then eventually they add literacy tests as a way of deciding who can come into the country and who can't. We see a backlash in the form of the first Red Scare, which was in this time period. And the first Red Scare obviously leads to growing fears of immigrants, that immigrants are bringing over dangerous ideas. The first Red Scare happens in 1918, and right at the end of World War I. And then that walks us into the very end of this period, which shuts the door on a lot of immigrants, which is the Quota Acts. And the Quota Acts essentially create such large restrictions on who can come into the United States and who can't, that it really cuts off the flow of immigration during this time period. So we've got a major shift. I'm going to kind of zoom out here so we can see this. We've got a major shift happening in immigration, where we've got open immigration over here, and then we've got a growing backlash. There's still a backlash in every time period. That's one of the continuities in American history. But that backlash is growing to the point where those laws shift and we start to see major restrictions on who can come into the United States. We also see, obviously, over time, major shifts in who's coming, and a growing diversity in the number of people who are coming to America, where they're coming from, and also the reasons why they're coming to America. 1924 kind of ends this wave of immigration because of a number of things. The things that are cutting off this third period are the Quota Acts, which we already mentioned, and that's drying up immigration. But the other things are the Great Depression is going to lead to a lower number of immigrants coming into the United States because there aren't as many economic opportunities. And lastly, obviously, World War II. When the world is at war, that's going to end the time period, but it's also going to make it harder for people to immigrate into America. So these are just an overview of immigration, and it is absolutely worth your time to know this, because it is a strong possibility that there could be an immigration question.